Good morning, everybody. This is my nerd room. This is where all my junk is. So, okay, so let's see where we're at today. We should be just, nope, that's not right. No, that's not right either. Yeah, yeah. Bear with me. Ah, there we go. Okay, so we're getting into, we talked about cryptography before, so just the encryption methods that are used. That's kind of under the hood, right? We're not really going to be spending a lot of time thinking about that too much, except to the degree that it helps us to understand the stuff that we're working with here. And the stuff that we're working with is PKI, public key infrastructure, and Active Directory certificate services, which is one of the roles that you can install on a Windows server. Okay, so this can get a little bit complicated. Um, just so you know. It's going to take a little bit of practice, and we're going to do um, a couple of different instances of installing it, just to make sure that we get the repetition in. We kind of understand. We're going to do the basic single level ADCS install and configuration. That's as simple as it gets, and then after that, we go to the
You
two-layer
can restore to
offline
default.
implementation.
Okay,
That's more
so if
complicated, but it is the way that things are supposed to be done in general. Okay, whether you're publicly facing or whether you're not, two-layer is the recommended practice. Okay, so you might kind of ask, well, why bother doing the first one, right? The answer to that is first, not everybody follows the recommendation. Um, and that could be because of the lack of resources. Okay, so it is perfectly usable. You can function, everything functions just fine with a single layer Active Directory CS infrastructure. And so if you're, beggars can't be choosers, then that is a simpler and relatively less costly way of doing it. The two-layer offline, um, if you've got the resources for it, you should do it. Basically, that's the idea. Okay. So I'll do a little spiel, and then I'll talk a little bit about the exercises, and just understand that it's going to take you a week or two before you get your head around all the little details. And even then, there's going to be little exceptions all over the place with this kind of infrastructure. Okay. It is a kind of, nobody likes certificates. Um, even the people who advocate their use strongly, we all know that it's an imperfect system. It's just the best thing that we have right now. Okay. It's a complicated process. It's a complicated emotion. You like certificates? Yeah, we'll see about that, buddy. We'll see. We'll see. All right, so I'm going to get going on this, and I'll probably just kind of hop into some computers at a certain point just to illustrate some of the stuff here. Okay. Okay, so we're looking to identify what PKI is, some of the terms associated with it, the primary function of trust services in PKI, that is to say, what are we using this for? We're primarily using this to establish trust between parties who don't know each other. Okay. In a domain environment, the parties don't know each other, but they all know the domain controller, and so that's something that we leverage, right? In the outside world, we use a certificate authority and largely browsers with pre-installed CAs to kind of establish a trust setup. Okay. We'll differentiate a public CA from an organizational CA. We're not really going to deal with public CAs that much because they always charge money, except for Let's Encrypt, maybe. And describe a certificate chain of trust and what that means. Okay. So these are just some terms built into this kind of infrastructure. Okay, so what is PKI? Uh, from Microsoft's perspective, it's a set of roles, policies, and infrastructure that are used to manage, distribute, and revoke digital certificates. So that doesn't help too much because then you're like, what's a digital certificate, right? But basically, digital certificates are kind of like passports, right? They identify who you are, and whether you're allowed to be where you are or whether you're allowed to do what you're doing. Okay, so if I'm a Canadian and I present my passport in France, there are certain things I'm allowed to do and certain things I'm not allowed to do, right? Like maybe I'm not allowed to go get a job, or I don't really know. Maybe I can't go on the welfare system there, right? Because I'm not actually French. So digital certificates serve a similar purpose. They kind of identify this is who the person is or this is who the machine is. It could be either a person or a machine. Um, and then it says this is what this certificate is for. So, in other words, don't use this except for the purposes that I'm listing in this certificate. So it could be you can use this for authentication. Okay? It could be that you're allowed to use it for encryption. For a web server, you could use it to set up encryption to just for web server purposes, but not for other roles. Okay, so not for, say, FTP, right? Um, so it is kind of specific about what you're allowed to, what it's letting you do, basically, or what it's vouching for. So, you give somebody a digital certificate, but behind all of that, there's a whole bunch of infrastructure that needs to work for that certificate to be trusted. And so the combination of all of this helps an organization to establish a secure way of transacting across either the internal network or across the internet, right? Um, really, even internally these days, it's become important to verify systems. In the past, we used to be kind of like, everything that's happening on the internal LAN, what happens there stays there. You know what I mean? Um, but that's kind of the old fast and loose approach. We don't do that anymore because there have been too many hacks, too many security incidences where someone gets in and then they have too much access, you know? So for PKI to work, we're looking to be able to exchange certificates between authenticated users and whatever resources and servers are out there, um, whether it's externally or internally. And this is what we call ADCS, uh, or a certification authority CA. Okay, the CA is just a short term that we use for cert authority. Okay, you'll notice that the domain name that I've chosen for this course is ca.ca. I just do that because I like to hear people say, well, are you on dca.ca.ca? Right? It just makes me giggle inside when people are like troubleshooting issues and they're all super serious, you know. It's a little bit of a pun for my own sake. Okay, if you're looking for more information, still more information, you can actually go to Microsoft Docs. They have a whole bunch of information about this. It's not always presented in the best way, but I do find that their examples are very useful. Okay, personally. Now, another thing to mention here is that Windows is not the only game in town. There are Linux certificate authorities. You can run this on a Linux system. It is a very different experience. Okay. I'm kind of toying with the idea of introducing that as an assignment in this course, like making it part of a lab, maybe. I'm looking at that right now. But to do that, if I throw you into the swimming pool, I want to make sure that you can swim. So I'll have to prepare some material if we're going to go that way. But Microsoft is not the only game in town, but at the same time, this course is Active Directory securing a AD, right? Linux mentioned. Ka-chink. Cha-chink. Yeah, so I may actually push us a little bit in that direction just to give you a taste, you know? It is a little bit harder to work with than the Windows one, kind of. It's just different, I would say is probably the way to put it. Much more command line. Okay. Okay, so the Windows Server Certification Authority role essentially just sets up an IIS server on the certificate authority that you're going to set up. And within that, there's a bunch of scripts that can be run to generate digital certificates for either people or for computers. Okay. Now, there's also listening services. So you could do it through a web page with IIS, but you can also use group policy to auto enroll user accounts, auto enroll computer accounts. Um, Auto enrollment is a really useful tool because it takes a huge burden off of the administrator. It's kind of like DHCP, but for digital certificates, right? Um, but it can't do everything. There are more complex and subtler um, certificate configurations that it just can't handle that easily. It's less work just to do it manually if it's something you don't have to do for everybody. Okay. So you're going to find that sometimes you're going to be doing stuff manually. Sometimes you're going to be setting up group policy. Those are both useful skills to have. Okay. So how do we use this? PKI essentially sets up some trust services where you're always dialing back to the CA to verify whether a certificate is legit or not. Okay, so those are called trust services. They'll confirm and deny whether you should actually trust a digital cert with the assumption that the CA is trustworthy, right? Now, that assumption is based on the fact that we're using group policy to push out its digital cert to everybody. So if your group policy is not hacked, then that's a reasonable assumption that you can trust that CA. Okay. So the objective of the trust services is to meet certain requirements. It's the CIA with an N on top of it: confidentiality, integrity, authenticity, and non-repudiation. So this is a classic kind of. They used to do the CIA triangle. Apparently now it's a quadrangle, whatever shape that is. We'll call it a diamond. Okay. But I'll explain each of those just so we understand the difference between them. They're all purposes that can be served with PKI, but you don't necessarily uh, satisfy all of these conditions all of the time. Sometimes you're just looking for confidentiality. Okay. But typically, we want to have all available. Okay. So confidentiality, this is making sure that other people can't poke into and peek into your transmissions over the network. Okay. So even if data is intercepted, it just looks like garbled junk, right? That's essentially what encryption does. It makes non-random data look like randomness. Okay. It's not really random, but there's no way that someone from the outside without a key can really tell. So SSL is a good example of that, encrypting traffic between a client and a server, or a client and a client, actually. So really, it depends on your use case. Okay, but if you don't want people snooping, confidentiality is really important. Now, integrity is it sounds kind of similar, but it's not quite the same thing. Here, the idea is that not only are people not snooping, but they're not able to modify the data in any way. Okay. So I know that if I send somebody, or if somebody receives a message from me, they will be able to know that it came from me and hasn't been changed. Okay. So the not being changed part is what integrity is. Okay. So the receiver should always be able to feel comfortable and verify that the data hasn't been modified. Authenticity, that should actually be, well, authentication. Okay, so basically what we're doing is we want to be able to prove that not only was the data not changed, but it actually came from me, right? Now there are different ways that we do that in, like, say, if you're doing an e-transfer, there's the email address, which is not the most secure thing in the world. But there's also, um, you have to answer some kind of a code, let's say, if you're not setting up automatic transfers, where it's a question. Like with my mom, it's always, she always asks me a question about a pet that we used to have, right? So I can answer that. Most people can't answer it. Don't ask me the name of the pet, right? But that's the idea, is that then um, when I'm receiving the money, they know that they sent it to the right person. That's authentication, essentially. Now, what trust services do, they don't involve my pet, right? They actually have their own process, which is typically, if you sign something with your own private key, that's considered authenticating because everybody can take your public key. They can then decrypt anything I send with my private key. And uh, if that doesn't come out as junk, then it came from me, right? So just making sure that we're not being man in the middle or anything like that. Okay. Now, non-repudiation is a separate concern, which is just that if I do send you something, I can't deny that I sent it to you. Okay. So, for example, with email, it's very easy to craft a fake email and to send it to somebody. Uh, and I could use someone else's email address, and they would not be able to casually tell whether it actually came from that person or it came from somebody else. Okay, and that's just because email was not designed with security in mind. It was designed in the '60s when everybody thought that love would fix everything. It was a hippie kind of thing. Nowadays, we know that people will take advantage of that ruthlessly, and that spam is never going to leave us. So when we set up trust services here, non-repudiation was an important factor that we wanted to be able to say, you know what? Not only did it come from this person, but I can prove, like I can prove that it came from them. I can also prove that they sent it. Like it is theirs, but I also know that they're the ones who sent it to me. Okay. So only the sender has access to the private key and proves the origin of the message. Okay. Now, there are sub-roles within the ADCS role structure. So there are role services, that's what we call them. The big ones that we're going to be using is certificate authority. That's the classic one. So if you go back to Windows Server 2003, there's not much more than this, really. If you go to certification authority web enrollment, this is essentially just going to a web page. Okay. Um, Actually, is that right? Hold on, let me think about that. Yeah, that is just going to the web page. So I mentioned before that uh, when you install a CA role, it's gonna set up IAS. That's what this is for. So you can go to a web page and you can make a request for a cert. You can fill out all the details. It makes you jump through some hoops, and then it'll give you a certificate. Okay. The certificate authority is a much more manual process where you're going into an MMC snap-in and you're manipulating certificates, maybe generating them for the user. Okay. With web enrollment, the user can make the request, but it's still fairly manual. Okay. Online responder is when we say that we're constantly checking back to verify digital certs with the CA. The online responder's role is to give the thumbs up or the thumbs down on any particular digital cert verification. Okay. And there's actually a thumbs up, there's a thumbs down, and there's like I don't really know. And so, that's kind of the in between where, depending how you configure your software, you may proceed or you may not. Generally, it's not a good idea to proceed if it doesn't know the answer to whether this is a legit digital cert. But that does happen sometimes because of access issues. Okay. So if you're not in contact, say, with the internet, there are certain things you might not be able to check, right? And the online responder might be like, you know. Network device enrollment service, we're not going to use that in this class. But basically, if you have routers and switches and things like that that need certificates, uh, this can help you automate that process. Okay, it's a little bit deeper and a little bit more networky than we're really going to go into, but it's really very similar to web enrollment. It's just it's more automated. It's actually closer to Active Directory group policy integration, except that the devices are very simple and they don't speak Active Directory. Okay. So this is an alternative method for them to get certificates without the administrator having to deal with each one individually. And then there's certificate enrollment web services. This is where we automate these two processes. Okay. So um, it could be you have a developer who wants to make, they have an app where they're going to request certificates. So a developer can actually talk to certificate enrollment web services and can fetch a certificate for their application for your environment. Okay. It's again, it's a more advanced for us. It's more of a programmer thing, but it is something that's available for developers. Okay. So we'll use primarily the top three. Okay. Now, a few terms that we want to get in our head is root versus subordinate CAs. There's a hierarchical structure, just like DNS, okay, to certificate of authorities. And so you've got to have a root at the top of that hierarchy, but you don't want to burden it with too many requests because that will slow down its responses. So when we're doing online responder, if the root is constantly being queried, that actually will bog it and the entire infrastructure down. Okay. So what we want to do often is to set up subordinate certificate authorities. Now, if you're in an Active Directory environment, one CA is enough functionally. Okay. From a security standpoint, we set up a root, what we call an offline root, where we do have two certificate servers. One of them is the root, one of them is the subordinate, and the root we just turn off, and it just stays turned off for years at a time. Okay. But it comes in an emergency. It's like Batman, you know. Maybe Batman is Sammy's guy. It's like Spider-Man, you know. But the idea here is it can save your bacon when something really bad happens to your subordinate. It's not that you need both operational all the time. It's that if the subordinate gets hacked, the root can always come in, take away its legitimacy, and create a new subordinate, and then it can go back to sleep, right? So certificate trust is always based on the reputation of the CA. The subordinate gets its trust from the root. Okay. So I trust the subordinate as a client because I trust the root, and the root says he's good. Okay. Um, so a certified well-known CA can grant certificates to other CAs. That's a special ability. And this grants the subordinate CA trust. So that's just what I was talking about. And to the clients, it can also distribute certificates. Okay. So what that means is that not only can the root issue certs, but the subordinate can issue certs, and everybody's okay with it because the root says so. Okay. It's like having middle management, you know. A root CA is usually powered down, so it really is turned off. They don't, well, okay, what they recommend is you'll see some people who say, don't make your root CA a virtual machine. It's okay to make it a virtual machine because, if you're turning it off, you bring it back up 5 years later, um, you don't want to deal with old hardware and all that kind of stuff. And if it's broken or something like that. So a VM is a good choice. But what you don't want to do is keep it active in some kind of virtual environment. You don't want anybody to be able to turn it on randomly. So if someone hacks in, you don't want them to be able to power on that root CA, get into it, and then issue a new subordinate or anything like that. Okay. So what they recommend is that you archive it, take it offline, and store it somewhere securely. Okay. So it's usually powered down. It's usually taken out of the network so that nobody can mess with it, and you only bring it back. It's like the nuclear option essentially. Okay, so different AD certificate services hierarchies. Here we've got a root CA, um, kind of sitting pretty. You've got some policy CAs. This is what you'll see on the outside world a lot of the time. um, some policy CAs that are subordinate, and their job is just to handle all the rank and file below. Okay, below that you'll get issuing CAs, which can then talk to the clients and actually issue certificates. And if you're ever so this is a 3 tier. We're not going to go any further than a 2 tier. Okay, and we're only doing an offline 2 tier, really. But with the 2 tier, you've got the root CA, and you just have one or two issuing CAs. One is enough most of the time, but if you want redundancy, you'll have two in place, right? Redundancy is not for load. Redundancy is just for whether anybody's offline, essentially. So if one of these goes down, everything still functions, right? But this will always be down. That's the idea. This kind of infrastructure, you must have a lot of machines or you're external to need this level of hierarchy. Okay, so VeriSign, I could totally see them using a setup like this. But within an Active Directory environment, you don't really need to go any further than this. Okay. Now, standalone versus enterprise CAs. Um, you can have an Active Directory integrated CA, which is what we'll be doing most of the time. Because that's what we're leveraging in this class is, combining Active Directory and this encryption authentication setup. Okay. But you can also have a standalone. And so anything that's in the outside world, anything like VeriSign, GoDaddy, all those CAs are standalone. They're not part of a Windows domain or anything like that. But when you're in a domain environment, you're typically dealing with enterprise CAs. Okay. With the exception of the root. The root is actually standalone. Um, and so it's not joined to the domain. It could be joined, but really we don't want to do that because we're going to shut it off and leave it off for a very long time. And so that could just break things, right? So the typical behavior is to create an offline standalone root CA, and then we delegate control to an Active Directory joined enterprise CA. Okay. So the enterprise CA is integrated with Active Directory. It's got a few extra bells and whistles that allow for more automation, group policy, etc. And we like that. That's useful. Okay. That's the bulk of the tricks that we'll be using in this course here. Okay, so standalone CA, typical usage, you typically use a standalone for offline CAs or out on the internet. Okay. Um, An enterprise CA, you typically use it to issue certificates within your AD environment, often integrated with group policy. You can't use it as an offline CA. You're not supposed to. Okay. Dependencies, a standalone CA doesn't need Active Directory services. In fact, it doesn't care about it at all. An enterprise CA integrates itself heavily with it. The certificate request methods are much more manual for a standalone CA. That's because you're not expected to use it that much. Okay. But there's no group policy integration or anything like that. Network devices, things like that. It's often there's an administrator who's having to approve things. Okay. That might be scripted to some degree, but it's not, that's usually a unique instance. Somebody's come up with a solution themselves. There don't tend to be services for this kind of thing. Let's Encrypt is a notable exception to that, but they've come up with their own solution. Okay. With an enterprise CA, you can request certificates by manual enrollment, so you can still do the manual process, web enrollment, group policy, auto enrollment, enrollment on behalf, so you can do it on behalf of somebody else as an administrator, and then web services for application developers. So there's a lot more options in an enterprise. Yeah. Issuance methods, the CA administrator has to manually approve all the requests. Okay, so you got a human in there, you can't take them out of the equation. Enterprise CA, a lot of it can be automated, but not all of it for sure. Okay, there are certainly things that still have to be done manually. One example is if you ever set up another CA, like a subordinate, that's always going to be a manual process. Okay, so the tier AD hierarchy, you have a domain controller, but the standalone root CA is not joined to the domain. And if they issue its own root certificate, we're going to plot it over to the domain controller, and we're going to say, domain controller, set up a policy so that everybody accepts this certificate that's owned by this root CA. Okay. So that assures that all the machines are going to trust that CA. Then the CA issues a certificate for an enterprise subordinate, which is joined to the domain, and its job is to do most of the work. Okay, but the reason that we trust it is because the root CA said so. The reason we trust it is because the domain controller said so. Okay, so you might ask, well, why aren't we just telling using the domain controller to trust this implicitly? That means that this root CA can never come back and blow this away if it gets hacked for some reason. Okay, so the idea is we trust this because we trust this, and this is inaccessible until such a time as somebody brings it back for an emergency. Okay. The domain controller, on the other hand, cannot be inaccessible. And so we don't want it to be the one who's explicitly blessing this subordinate. Okay. Because if it gets hacked, then they can release as many subordinates as they want to. We don't want that trust to work that way. We always want it to go back to a root CA. Okay, a certificate chain of trust. I'm just going to show you this with a real example here. So let's go to, it's a nice image, but we can see that and a little bit better if we just log into any random Windows system. Okay, so this is my DC for this course. And I'm just going to open up a PowerShell admin prompt. And I'm just going to go for the MMC. Now, do I want that? Yeah, I think I do. And go File, Add Remove Snap-in. And you want to go to Certificates. Okay. Go Add. Now, when you're being asked, there's different types of routes that you can actually connect into to look at certificates. So you can look at your own certificates. You can look at the computer certificates. And you can also deal with service accounts. Okay. I'm going to take a look at a computer account just quickly here on the local computer. And I go, okay. And here I've got what's called the certificate store. Okay. So every computer has a certificate store, and every person, every user account, and every computer itself has a setup like this all to themselves. Okay. So when I'm connecting to the local computer's certificate store, and I'm looking at the personal certs, which right now I don't have any, what that is doing is I'm looking at the personal certs of the local computer, not my own. Okay. So if I want to, look at my own, I can go to certificates, add, and this time I'll go to my user account. I go finish, and we go okay. And now I've got another one for the current user. Okay. You don't want to confuse those two. But these are basically certificates that are in my space that I can look at and manipulate. So because I'm an administrator on this machine, I can look at the local computer. And because I'm me, I can look at the current user. Okay. So if we look here at the administrator certificate that already exists for myself as the administrator, I can check out the cert, and it will tell me who's issued it. Shot one. Um, the issuer is basically, hold on, let me check if there's a purpose here. Subject, public key. Yeah, key usage, file recovery. Okay. So what this particular cert is for is to recover files when I'm encrypting them in this environment. What that means is that I can't use it for everything. I can only use it for this purpose. Okay. So in the end, you're going to be creating a bunch of different certs for the same person or the same computer because each of those certs serves a different function. Okay. Just a way of kind of keeping it clean. Now, this one is self-signed, so if we go back to the certificate chain of trust, we've only got one entry, and that's because I'm trusting myself, and that's all I'm doing. Okay, which is not the most secure thing. Now, if I go over to, let's see, let me just see what we got here. Yeah, okay, I don't want to do him. Let's a little further down. Enterprise Trust. No, I got nothing there. Trusted publishers. Yeah, maybe. Let's check him out. Yeah, so if I go here, I get a much more similar setup to what we were looking at here. Okay, but now we can poke around with it a little bit. So if I go into this and let's say I just double click on the one just above. So Microsoft Corporation, this lowest level, this is the cert we're dealing with. When I double click on this one, this is the certificate of the entity that issued this certificate. Okay. Down here, it's telling me the certificate is okay. Why is it telling me it's okay? Because there's an online service that I can check back against, which will actually follow this path and determine whether all of the sources are actually trusted. Okay. So what it's saying is this cert is good because this cert is good, and this cert is good. I'll just close that because this cert is considered to be trustworthy. Okay. And that's the top of the hierarchy. So this is Microsoft's root certificate authority. They've set up their own, um, and it's good until 2036. Okay, so after 2036, if I haven't updated this, then I can no longer trust this root authority. Okay, how is Microsoft going to change that? Probably through Windows Update. Okay, how do we change it in our environment? We have to issue a new cert through our root authority. Okay. So Microsoft does it through updates. We do it through group policy and manual issuing. Okay. So that's essentially what a chain of authority is. Okay, we're going to be getting to the exercises in a little bit here. Actually, I think we go straight into it here. So I do want you to do the standalone certificate authority just because it's a bit easier. When you go to the offline root version, there's a lot more details, and it's going to be a little confusing if you jump into it right away. Okay, so repetition is kind of key for this initial period where you're wrapping your head around certificates. Okay, it's okay if you break something. You just kind of go back and tweak it. We might be able to save it. You might have to rebuild. There's a lot of little details. You just need to pay attention to them. Okay. But, everything is recoverable in the end, right? Any questions before I intro the assignments here? Okay. All good. All right. I'll take your word for it. So installing the enterprise root CA. This is not the recommended way of doing it, but it is the baby steps that kind of give you the basic lowdown of how this can function. Okay. And this is something that legitimately operates out in the real world. So you follow this, it's pretty paint by number, but I do want you, don't try and rush through it. I want you to understand some of the things that you're running here. You're not going to understand all of it right away, but if you're having errors, you should probably just kind of talk to me a little bit because I could probably guide you through it. As we keep doing this, it's going to be more and more clear what errors mean, okay, and whether they're a big deal or not. But this one, we go into a pretty deep configuration of different parts of, how long a certificate is good for, how long revocation lists are good for. We're going to talk about all that later in the lecture. But for now, we're just setting it up quickly. Okay. Now, going back to the two-tier, you know, uh, I'm only going to have you do this one once. Then we're going to wipe it out. So it's just an experience. Okay. The offline two-tier is what we're going to work with through the rest of the term. Okay? This is more involved, and it's a little more confusing because we're having to do a whole bunch of jumping through hoops. Moving files around from one server to another, running a bunch of obscure commands. It's a little less obvious than the first one, but at the same time, it is the recommended method. Okay. This will take you longer. I think I'm setting aside 2 to 3 class periods for this. So this period now, plus a couple of extra, I will be doing a little bit of lecture, but you're probably going to need that time to get everything functioning. Okay. Now, just going back, I have a couple of caveats here. For this particular offline two-tier, notice that there's a comment here. There's a problem with integrating offline CAs with Active Directory domain. Okay. So there's a fix that I've posted here. I don't know if I've put it into the document, but if it's not there, that's why I posted this up. I'll double check that. If it is there, you shouldn't bump into this problem, but you'll know it when you do bump into it because you won't be able to proceed. Okay. So basically, offline CAs can't use active LDAP. They're not able to talk to LDAP very effectively. And that introduces some issues when you've got a subordinate that can use LDAP and you've got an offline route that doesn't. The offline route essentially has to be configured not to even try to use it. Okay. So that's what this essentially does. It points to LDAP services without actually making use of them. This is the source of where we got this fix. Um, Again, I will check the document, but just in case I hadn't posted it in from last term, I'm just posting this up here. So if you bump into that problem, just refer back to this. Okay. Okay, and I think that's pretty much it, unless there are questions from you guys. Otherwise, I'll let you get to it. Like I said, we want to spend a couple of days on this. Okay. And I'll still be doing some lecture in between to fill in some gaps. Aiden, do you still like certificates? He's not listening. Yes. Okay. Keep me updated on that. I'll let you guys go.